As coaching's become more prominent, it's always been something that's very, very important, but over the last, I don't know, 30 years or so, people have really identified the impact that coaching can have on the individual participant. And this can take place in a variety of different ways, but lots of times we talk about the old adage that there's two ways of looking at it. One, sport builds character, or more recently, people have talked about, since you can't, the difference between causation and correlation is very, very different. A lot of people say sports reveals character. Either way, the whole idea and kind of the central theme of that is that sport is somehow associated with character development. So the big question is, and I've asked this of every ethics class and sociology of sport class and psychology, what is character? What is character? And it's something that's actually kind of hard to define for a lot of people. They say, well, I know it when I don't see it. Okay. Well, character is, there's a lot of gray. There's no black and white. It's usually thought of as ideas or beliefs, things that are associated with a vague general sense of morality with sports. And that's since the mid 1990s when this research really started to develop, because and a lot of this was because money was being pumped into the sport institution, especially youth sports, scholastic sports, intercollegiate athletics, and people were saying, well, it develops character. Okay, well, you kind of need to evaluate that. I mean, if that's your belief, then here's to hoping that it works. But if we don't have any information, then we'll never actually know. And so that's when this research started. And generally, what you find is that there's going to be different ways of conceptualizing character. If it's associated with morality, and morality, kind of from an ethics or philosophy point of view, has to do with, kind of ideals for behavior and actions, that type of thing. And so, as those are implemented within sport, then things like fair play, good sporting behavior is actually sportsmanship. It's not the proper nomenclature anymore. There's been some discussion that sportsmanship says the word men, that leaves out women, and that type of thing. It used to be good, instead of sportsmanship, it was sportspersonship. So that was extremely difficult to say, and so I'm actually glad we moved on to good sporting behavior, just because I don't get nearly as tongue-tied as I used to. But the idea of character is sort of loosely associated with morality, good sporting behavior, fair play. Those are the types of things that are going to be in sport. Okay, well, if you start looking at the different aspects, or as Michael Josephson talks about, 6 pillars of character. And I think this is important because if we don't really understand what character is, right, because it's very, very difficult, then breaking it down into little pieces, parts, it makes it a little bit easier. Society, talking about society, it's very difficult, but if you break it down into states, into counties, into towns or communities, then it's a little easier to understand. That's kind of what they're doing here. And so you have caring, citizenship, fairness, responsibility, respect, and trustworthiness. Again, there's a link there that you can jump on and look at kind of these things in more detail. But I think it's important because what does it mean to be trustworthy? What's it mean to have respect or responsibility, display responsibility? All these different things. Like, we know what we're supposed to do with regards to these things, but truthfully, are they being implemented within sport? Or are we adhering to these very, very important pillars or these values that are supposed to be so important? And if we're not, then that says something. What does it say? Well, it says either sport is maybe not this thing that builds character, but we don't want to let go of that. So then the onus is kind of on the individual, and then we start thinking, they're just morally corrupt. But then ask yourself, as a fan, as a consumer, do you really care about the character of your sport team or organization that you're following? So it's a very, very nuanced thing, and that's what's important here, is that we tend to treat character very simply, and it's really much more complex. And so when we start talking about the coach's role, or coaches, and how they develop this amorphous idea. One of the things that we find is that there's actually social character and there's moral character. Moral character is exactly what it sounds like, and much more associated with morality, whereas the social character tends to be much more associated with social values that we believe to be important, like hard work, those types of things. And so, you can make the argument that, coaches are developing maybe a little bit more of the social character as compared to the moral character. But regardless, the point is that coaches are part of that process. Now, this does bring up a very interesting question, at least for me. The way that I think about it is, okay, if coaches are so important in this process, how come we don't teach coaches this aspect of coaching? And that's going to be something, obviously, when you start dealing with the coaching education program and that type of thing, it becomes important. Well, if we're trying to ascertain the importance of coaching, again, falling back on that whole military strategy process of decision-making and understanding different things, and observe, orient, decide, and then act. Well, observe and orient yourself. Basically what that means is be quiet, sit back, and learn. Look at what's going on within the world of sports. You can't be efficient, you can't be successful, you can't be productive, and you can't evolve the institution if you don't know what's going on. And if you don't know what's going on, that means you have not been able to explain it. And these approaches to character development are just ways of, they're theories, and we're not going to go real in-depth into them, but it's ways of trying to explain how the coach is involved in this character development process. And the very, very first one, probably the most simple one you can think of, is social learning, which is just role modeling. That's it. And so, I always find this interesting. I'd go to conferences to work with high school football coaches. And when you're there, there's a lot of out of shape, overweight, potentially obese people. And these individuals, when it comes to their season, many of them will be sort of very, very loud and talkative to their athletes about losing weight, being in shape, being in football shape. Yet here you have someone who is obviously not in shape whatsoever. All right? That can actually erode not just the message, but the messenger. So if a coach isn't able to isn't able to model what they believe to be important, then why should the people that are subject to them, the athletes, for example, why should they believe what they're saying? And that goes back to this social learning approach. And so when you're thinking about character development, okay, the social aspect of character, one would be, being healthy mind, healthy body, commitment to your team, and all those different types of things. I understand coaching is a 24-hour day profession, but at some point, you can look at film while you're on a treadmill or something like that, And so this is one of the things that I remember talking with lots of, these were high school football players at the time, and this was something that came up. This is why I started thinking about it, is they're like, well, he was always telling me to lose weight, or wrestling coaches as well. I got to make weight, yet here they were, and they didn't take any control or ownership over their physical health. So in that regard, the social learning approach, there was a disconnect between the coach and the athletes. The structural development approach says, okay, basically, you can only understand character based on how old you are and how much your mind has developed to understand this very, very, very difficult idea of character. Okay, your mind has to develop to the point that you can understand these abstract ideas. And that's pretty important. That makes sense. So, when you're young, and I always make this analogy or tell this story all the time, so if you've heard it before, just pretend like you haven't, and then it's a wonderful story that will change your life for the rest of this particular abbreviated semester. Anyway, when I was playing youth baseball, okay, we were horrible, all right? At one point, my youth baseball teams were terrible, my high school baseball teams were terrible. There wasn't a whole lot of winning that was going on. And I just remember, when I was little, you went through that sportsmanship line where you're like, good game, good game, good game. You kind of shake the hands, or you would, slap high fives or whatever with the opposing team. And it's not that I was lying when I was going through that. It was just something you had to do at the end of the game, because I was focused on getting, the pop that the coach brought. They'd have a little pop in the ice chest after the game, and I was always a big fan of the Welch's grape soda. And so there wasn't very many of them, so I had to get through the line really quickly so I can get the Welch's grape soda. All right, was I displaying bad sporting behavior at that moment? I don't think so. I think part of it was I was young. I didn't understand. I mean, the coach said, hey, you need to go do this. This is something that you're supposed to do. It's good. Okay. And so early on, what you're going to find is that the coach is going to be important because not only are they going to role model these things to the young athletes, but they're also going to say, look, this is what you have to do. You may not understand it now, and you try to teach them how and why it's important as they get older. And so again, that structural development approach is that, look, you understand that you're dealing with a bunch of 7 or 8-year-olds that may not get this very, very abstract concept, but you try. 6-year-old kids playing t-ball don't understand respect. That's a very, very difficult concept for even adults, let alone a 6-year-old whose mental capacity hasn't developed to understand these very, very complex ideas. The coach's job is to kind of ride that middle ground, show them that these things are important, and try to break it down in simplistic terms for them, and show that demonstrating good sporting behavior is important for showing respect and being a good person. You can do that in this game of baseball or whatever it is that whatever sport that you're involved with, and that is sort of a primer for life lessons. The social psychological approach talks about the individual and the situation, and sometimes managing emotions and things like that. And so those people that are not able to manage their emotions, and Bobby Knight throwing the chair across the basketball court there in the picture, that's showing that's demonstrating bad sporting behavior. It's hard to say that that's good character. And if you remember, some of you may not, I mean, if you're young enough, you may not remember, but do a little research on Bobby Knight. And he was kind of an interesting guy because always had an extremely high graduation rate. Education for his student athletes, his basketball players, was extremely important. He was very strict, and that was something he had a zero tolerance policy on. He said, look, my job is to develop good young men, productive members of society that are not just basketball players. These are good men. And then he was fired for choking one of the players. He's always demonstrated, throwing chairs or pounding the phone, or, he's always been like that. So he's kind of this back and forth. And so that's very, very difficult because you have an individual who stands for something that's very positive: education, graduation, developing young men. And then they're not able to manage their emotions, and they lose their water on the sidelines, and they start chucking chairs across and getting thrown out, and then eventually getting fired for slapping or choking a player. All right, and so that's what the social psychological approach is looking at, is trying to understand how character fits within those unique situations. Pat Forty did a great column years ago when he was writing for Yahoo Sports News about how we let coaches off the hook. Because it's an emotional game, we let them display really, really bad behavior. We let them, and we're okay with that, and that we let them display this poor character, and this is something that we need to change. Well, all right, as you kind of start thinking about that, that's a column from a journalist who tend to be very self-reflexive, and so I want you to take a moment and identify an example in sports where each approach is appropriate. Think about character, think about coaches, and using those different outline approaches, think about, an example from either your own life or something you remember from the popular media. Now that you've thought about, whatever the example of those theories and coaches and character development, all that type of stuff, now that you've thought about that, let's start to consider some of the things that are an extension of that idea that sport builds character. This is an idea that goes back, that physical activity in sport is associated with moral constitution and good character. This goes back hundreds of years. All right. If you're talking about just here in the United States, this goes back to the 1850s, and this whole idea of rugged individualism and the transcendental idea that that young men especially need to be outdoors and they need to be physical, and that's why you have the development of Yellowstone and Yosemite, these national parks and all this kind of stuff. Well, all that is associated with some of these ideas, and one of the questions is, does being involved in youth sport prevent someone from getting into trouble? Does it prevent deviant behavior? Deviant's not just criminal behavior, okay? There are differences there. And in some research, for example, there has shown that being involved in extracurricular activities does have a positive impact on individuals because of the whole idea of being able to set goals and achieve goals, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and overcome those barriers or challenges, and to motivate yourself to be better and those types of things. All right, and so to answer this question, okay, does it promote or prevent deviant behavior? One of the things that we can do is we can kind of again use a case study and look at scholastic sports. All right, so I'm talking about high school sports. Now, deviant behavior, one of the main sources or forms of deviant behavior would be delinquency. And that doesn't mean just not going to school. It means that within the educational system there are distinct rights and wrongs. Okay, and so students are supposed to, there's a thing called student role performance, and you're supposed to be able and fulfill the obligations of your role, which has to do with doing your homework and so on and so forth. All right, well, does being involved in sports have a positive or negative impact on that, or is there no impact at all? Well, to answer that question, you can do a couple different things. You can gather tons and tons and tons of information, all right, an empirical approach, which is, I did that. I did a research study where we looked at, basically middle school and high school sport participation, and are those individuals more likely to be delinquent or not delinquent? And so, had 24,414 completed surveys from 8th and 9th graders from all over the United States. And what they found was that athletes, from that empirical point of view, athletes in that sample were more likely to be involved in deviant or delinquent behavior. They're more likely to get in trouble. Now, it was different for boys and for girls. For girls, there was a positive impact. For boys, not so much. Well, it's difficult to do that. Empirical means you're going out and you're gathering information, right? And so to answer this question, you go out and you gather 25,000 surveys. And you can't do that if you're a coach or you're thinking about, trying to justify why you should have a youth sport program or something like that. So what these different theories allow you to do is answer the same question without gathering 25,000 surveys. Okay? And so the very first one, differential association, basically says that we learn behavior, both good and bad, in small groups, especially small groups of our peers. All right? Well, a lot of the theoretical research would say that athletes have less interaction with those that get in trouble, so therefore they're going to be more likely to not be in trouble. Okay? The social bond says basically you have a strong bond with your school, and there's all these different, there's 4 different categories of the social bond, and we don't need to go into that, but basically it's, if you participate in sports, it illustrates that you are connected to those traditional activities and values in your school. All right, you're not raging against the machine because you're involved, a lot of your time is involved in an activity that the school, the community, society, American culture deems as traditional, normal, and good. Okay? Or the labeling theory or labeling hypothesis says that once a tag or label is placed on you, that's how people act and interact with you. And so being labeled as an athlete, especially for young men, actually provides preferential treatment. So this is, it's good for the individual, but that's kind of a deviant thing. So answering that question, what have we found? I don't know. I did research that said, hey, look, they're more likely to get in trouble. Labeling theory says, hey, sometimes being labeled as an athlete allows people to give you grades or go out of their way and do some things for you. Differential association and social bonds say being involved in scholastic sports is actually a good thing, and it helps to benefit the individual and eventually the group. So what you're starting to see is that there's no clear cut, and that's where the social psychological explanation comes in. It depends on the sport. It depends on the community or the school. It depends upon the individuals. It depends upon the teachers. It depends upon the family. There is no... It's kind of a crappy question because it's a very big question. Does sport prevent delinquency in school? Well, it sort of depends on the school. Depends on what delinquency you're talking about. We know that for girls and young women that participate in sports, they're less likely to... they're more likely to have fewer sexual partners. They're less likely to have a child out of wedlock. They're more likely to complete their high school and then pursue and complete college education. That's good. That's a good thing. And that maybe is associated with differential association. Okay? Well, but that doesn't necessarily hold true for boys. And also, we don't want to talk about sports as this very large thing because let's be honest. If you're the starting quarterback for the football team, that's a little bit different than being the second or third best cross-country runner on the cross-country team. I'm not saying cross-country is bad. I'm saying in terms of popularity, in terms of community support, it's generally a little bit lower than football, basketball, and some of those larger sports. And so that's what's important here, is that whenever you're trying to answer a question, is you have to take a lot of things into consideration. And these small theories help you kind of move in a particular direction to answer that question if you can't go out and gather all kinds of surveys. So, some things, some strategies for trying to develop character within sport. These are just some different things right there, and I'm not going to go over blow by blow, because you're all intelligent people and can figure these things out for yourself. And truthfully, when you get a recipe card like this, it doesn't tell you how to define good or bad behavior. It just says that you need to do so as a coach for your team. It doesn't say which appropriate behaviors you should role model. It just says that as a coach or in your coaching staff should model the appropriate behaviors. You decide all those different things. One of the things that's going to be important, though, is the very last one: create a task-oriented motivational climate. What does that mean? That means you focus on the task. So if you're providing constructive criticism, you don't criticize the person. You try to get them to change their behavior. Behavioral intervention plan that we've talked about earlier in the semester. It's not criticism directed toward the person as much as the action. And if you do that and you show them how changing this particular behavior can actually improve something, then that's going to increase their motivation, and it creates what we call an autonomous learning climate or atmosphere for that team. And that's really important, because those are the people that feel good about their coaches, the participants that feel like they understood how to be successful. Even if they weren't successful, those are the people that have positive views of sport and tend to be more likely associated with sport or some sort of physical activity later in life. And that's what the coach is trying to do, is to show them and to teach them how, some of the important things that sport can provide, not just at that moment, but for the rest of their life. The other thing is, I talked a little bit about this when we talked about character, is this old sort of archaic notion of constitution, which I think is kind of interesting. You had moral constitution, and then you had your physical constitution, and we don't need to go into the difference of those, but using that as kind of a background to understand and contextualize this discussion, one of the things you see is that sport can positively impact a lot of different things. Okay, one is the sense of being resilient. Okay, you get knocked down, but you're able to get back up. That's a value that is extremely important to us here in American culture. How do you teach that? Where do you teach that? Oftentimes the coach within sport or physical activity, that's one place you can do it. Along with this whole idea of autonomy, we talked about being able to do something on your own, a sense that I can accomplish something and complete something without the need or the guidance of someone holding my hand. And what that then does is allow for increased social competence or cooperation. Basically, you're a good team player. You can interact with people. All right? Now, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be a great person. Again, all these different things are different aspects. Okay? What you're trying to avoid is this sense of learned helplessness, where the athlete, especially if they're coddled early on and sort of given a lot of praise and adulation because they're good at something. We have websites that say, hey, this is the best 5th grade basketball player in the United States, all right? And people start coddling that individual. Then they let other aspects, that retards other aspects of their life, because they feel like, I don't need to focus on my education. I don't need to focus on, working hard outside of sports. I mean, within sports, they're doing all these wonderful things, but that's not necessarily translating to other aspects or facets of their life. The other thing, and this is kind of the last point, is that, and this is very difficult in modern sports. I'm not going to act like it's not and it's easy to do, but winning does not relate to moral development. And you can be an extremely successful coach in terms of developing individuals, young men and young women, and not be successful in terms of winning games. The problem is, it's not just that coaches want to win and that players want to win. It's that people that consume sport want to win. And you may have a coach who is wonderful at developing people and winning. And that always helps. famous kind of John Wooden example, Coach Wooden there, UCLA and all the NCAA championships and those types of things. But how do you go about if you're an athletic director, for example, and you have a coach that Pat Summitt was always very outspoken about developing young women when she coached basketball and was extremely successful with more than 20 national championships, I believe, or whatever, or conference championships, that type of thing at University of Tennessee. She felt that developing people was important. Now she was successful as well, and so she was lauded as being an extremely important, successful coach. What happens if you're an athletic director and you have someone who's following, say, Pat Summitt's model or Coach Wooden's model of, hey, I'm going to develop young men and young women, but they're not as successful when it comes to the X's and the O's or the winning of the game. That's something to think about, and that's kind of an overriding element with regards to understanding coaching, good sporting behavior, and moral development, is that for a coach to be allowed to do that, the environment for the coach has to be one of success, and success does not always mean wins and losses. And so that now it's up to families in a community to not get mad when a team is losing and ask for demand the coach to resign. It's also up to the athletic department. It's up to those other governance types organizations to reward those individuals who are developing and implementing these strong moral values or these strong character-based values within sporting programs.